there were a group of traveling scholars at that time. They were referred to as sophists. Sophist is the root word from which you get the term sophistry, or sophisticated. And they traveled around the Greek city-states at the time, and they're studying the different traditions of the Greek city-states and determining their notions of justice. And there's differences. This one had this view, this one had this view. And they came to the conclusion that justice is relative. People had different views, but it's relative. It all depends upon each person's view. And so now, today we think that the notion of justice is relative is a necessary prerequisite to have a tolerant society. But this is kind of naive thinking. The sophists were more sober in their thinking. If justice is relevant, then justice is the advantage of the stronger. Might makes right. It's the only sensible principle to go by if justice is relevant. So there was this sophist called Thrasymachus in the Republic who was arguing that justice is the advantage of the stronger. And Socrates was saying, no, justice is rendering what is due. And so, what do you mean rendering what is due? What is due to human beings? See, humans have a specific nature, and therefore justice is due to them because of that nature. And so this is the argument that is the basis of the Greek philosophical tradition, at least the Platonic tradition. There's a lot of things in Plato I don't agree with, but this basis is solid and dovetails very well with the Bible. And so this basis was used by a lot of, started in the Jewish tradition. Hellenistic Jews were making a synthesis between the best of Greek thought and the Jewish thought. And then that was picked up by Paul, and then later St. Paul in the New Testament. He was even a greater synthesis. And then you had the early church leaders, and they developed a synthesis. The synthesis was also picked up by the Romans. Now, what did the Romans bring to the table that Paul found so useful, and that actually the Roman Catholic Church adopted itself, and is why it's referred to as the Roman Catholic Church? In the Greek tradition, as well as the Jewish tradition, you had a notion of justice, as opposed to the assertion of will. And you had an absolute moral transcendent standard of justice in both of these traditions. In terms of institutionalizing them universally, you didn't have that. In the Greek, the Greeks had a philosophy of universal application of ideas. The Jews had a view of all men created equal, but in terms of the institutionalizing them, the Jewish tribal federation was one based upon a unity of faith and religion. A unity of faith and race. It was an ethnic unity. It didn't reach out beyond that. The Greek city-states, Greek-speaking male, had rights as citizens, could vote. But outside that, you still had slaves, and the slaves usually they didn't speak Greek, or they weren't part of this. They weren't part of the Hellene. Hellene was a cultural entity that was considered to be civilized, and the ones outside it were barbarians. And the word barbarian, in other words, it came from the language. If you didn't speak Greek, then it was an unintelligible thought. It was called barbarian. And so you had to speak Greek and think the way they did in order to be considered civilized. So in principle, they embraced a universal notion of justice to all human beings. In practice, in terms of their institutions, they did not. The Romans did not come up with anything in theory that was novel. They had adopted Greek ideas and put them into practice, but universally. The Roman civilization brought about the idea of a universal system of justice that applied to all human beings that could become Roman citizens. Paul was not a Roman by birth. He was not Latin. He came from Syria. He was Jewish, but he became a Roman citizen. That was the universal application of these principles was something that was that the early church saw as something useful. Starting with Paul, he used this example many times, in the state having the right to wield the sword. Well, as we said, the concept of the state in wielding the sword was not something that went back to the early Jewish, the right to wield the sword. They didn't have a state with the right to wield the sword. This was something the Romans had. And the universal citizenship was, in principle, universal justice was upheld by the Greeks and the Jews, but institutionally, it was the Romans who did it, institutionalize it. And so the term Catholic means universal. And so this notion of anyone can become Christian, it is a religious application of the Roman notion of that anyone can become a Roman citizen. And that's why they moved there. Well, one of the reasons, their tradition says that both Peter and Paul had their final days in Rome. That's one reason. But another reason why the capital of the center of global Christianity moved to Rome was because Rome was considered the universal city through which, it was this principle of universalism that this new and growing universal institution wanted to adopt. And so they moved on to that. Now, as I mentioned, this notion that the state has a right to wield the sword was seen by some as, well, yeah, maybe, but it's temporary. So later, a couple centuries later, you have different thinkers who are with different ideas that are saying, okay, that was a temporary expediency. Tertullian, who was he actually is not canonized in the Catholic Church because he differed over church authority. In terms of most of his theology, he was fairly orthodox. But in terms of accepting church or state authority, he wasn't very orthodox, so he wasn't canonized. But he was a second century Christian thinker that became a little bit radical, not in terms of his theology, but in terms of his view on authority. And he made the argument, he developed what is referred to as a conquest theory of the state.